There is no better company for tracking the history of gaming than Nintendo, from capturing the imagination of kids and adults alike with the splendor of the Famicom and NES, all the way to the stranglehold that the Nintendo Switch has over all of us. Nintendo has seen it all and been it all.
But what's the secret to their success? Perhaps the best way to learn that is to go through their entire console history and pick out the best game of every year. If nothing else, it's a good way to spend about an hour or so.
First of all, some important definitions. Nintendo in this video refers to any and all systems released by the company starting from the Famicom onwards and doesn't necessarily mean first party only. However, like our Xbox and PlayStation videos of the same kind, this article will only take into account console exclusives, including timed releases and, in a few cases, arcade games that made their home on Nintendo systems. So get settled, because I'm Sai, this is What Culture, and this is the best Nintendo game of every year from 1983 to 2024.
And as Mario might say, here we go.
1983, Donkey Kong. 1983 might be the single most important year in all of gaming history when you get right down to it. The rise in Japanese developers had an open path to dominance in the wake of the American video game crash, and Nintendo couldn't have picked a better year to introduce their first ever home console. The Famicom Entertainment System arrived in the Japanese market in July 1983, bringing some of the company's biggest arcade hits with it. Chief among them, of course, was Donkey Kong. Just on the surface, the game introduced us to both DK and Mario, two of Nintendo's most enduring mascots, even if they have vastly transformed along the way. Whilst the game can't necessarily be called the single point of origin for the platforming genre, many people take for granted that its main mechanic of having the player jump gaps and obstacles changed everything.
That in itself is an awesome legacy, but it also gave us people so obsessed with world record scores that they got into legal battles over whether or not they cheated to obtain them, which is a pretty unique claim to fame too.
1984, Excite Bike. Speaking of things we immediately took for granted, how does smooth horizontal scrolling grab you? No, Excitebike wasn't the first to showcase this, but it certainly pushed things forward with how quickly it appeared to do so when other systems were yet to confidently get the basics down. Shigeru Miyamoto's Motocross Racer was a huge deal for home console sports games for so many reasons, not least because it was intuitive and fun. Avoiding obstacles, other racers, and overheating made for a challenging and exciting title. Hence the name, really. It's also absolutely worth mentioning the design mode, which allowed players to create custom tracks. The Famicom data recorder device, which was exclusive to Japan, meant that drivers could save and then load these creations. Additionally, in the first year of Nintendo's foray into the US, Excitebike landed as the third best seller behind Pac-In's Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt, meaning it was the game most people gravitated towards to add to their game library. Neat. 1985, Super Mario Bros.
If Donkey Kong was the hop and 1983's first lead outing Mario Bros. Was the skip, then 1985's Super Mario Bros. Was the giant leap for Nintendo's mustachioed main man.
There aren't really enough superlatives to explain how important the game was. Most version of the Famicom's Western redesign, the Nintendo Entertainment System, came packed with Super Mario Bros. This meant that it had the responsibility of washing the low bar of quality from the late 70s and early 80s out of the memories of consumers, whilst introducing a new world of gaming as designed by Nintendo and Shigeru Miyamoto. World 1-1 taught players everything they needed to know as they navigated, for the first time ever, a world that scrolled as they moved forwards. With simple but clean graphics and instantly catchy music, Super Mario Bros. Was more than just a score-chasing arcade game. It was an obstacle course of challenge and wonder, continuously surprising players with new stage gimmicks and hidden secrets that the whole family could partake in. And that right there, that's basically the Nintendo blueprint. 1986, The Legend of Zelda.
By the time 1986 rolled around, with the NES now appearing around the world, the Famicom was really hitting its stride, with massive franchises like Metroid, Castlevania, and Dragon Quest taking their first steps.
With so much new IP, the closest to a sure thing was the next release from Super Mario genius Miyamoto, and so Nintendo sold over 1 million copies in Japan on the game's release day, and those 1 million fans went home with a game which changed the industry forever, The Legend of Zelda. Console games had never been this involving before, demanding players immerse themselves in its top-down world, which came printed on a paper map, in order to get the most out of it. Hyrule was as diverse as an 8-bit experience could be, filled with dangers to conquer, but also mysteries that rewarded the player's curiosity. The ability to go on an adventure from your own home summoned an unmatched sense of wonder. More than a genre, The Legend of Zelda created a tone and a feeling that gamers sought after. 1987, Final Fantasy. Inspired by Zelda, Dragon Quest, and the likes of the PC RPG Ultima, Square throwing their feathered cap into the ring led to perhaps the biggest RPG franchise to this day. One of the reasons for this is production quality. Final Fantasy's graphics were lush and interesting on the overworld, in dungeons, and during battle, where players would see their carefully selected and named 4 warriors of light in all of their glory taking commands. Every new area was set to unique music, the intricacy of which pushed what was expected out of the machine. But the real drive of Final Fantasy was its story. Whilst it was dialogue light by today's standards, the game felt like a whole series of novels squeezed into a single cartridge. Your friends who read The Lord of the Rings might have had lots of details to share with you, but you could say that you encountered the pirates, you encountered the vampires, you encountered the dragons, and experienced the shocking twist at the end of Final Fantasy.
The era of epics had arrived, at least contemporarily speaking.
1988, Mega Man 2. For a time, video game developers weren't necessarily sure how to approach sequels. In many ways, Capcom's Mega Man 2 showed that more of the same was absolutely a viable option. Mega Man already had an air of coolness that most other games struggled to crack, with strong character designs, bold use of colour to craft a set of immediately identifiable stages.
And let's be clear, Mega Man 2's soundtrack is goated, and it deserves its spot just for this alone. But I can't just talk about music, so it's a good thing that it's a great game too.
Mega Man 2 set a standard that the franchise and other games chased forevermore on all of these fronts and then some. The game was punishingly hard, only made fair by its tight controls. Mistakes were on the player's head, but the addictive feeling of piloting the heavy rock and the drive of the incredible design kept players coming back over and over, only to lose to Quickman yet again. It's got a lot of strong competition, but often being called the greatest 2D platformer of all time isn't bad for an iterative sequel. 1989, Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. Speaking of iterative sequels, this is not a term that could be said about Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest. Applying RPG and adventure game elements to the monster battling basics proved divisive at best, and a total train wreck at worst. And so 1989's Castlevania 3 went back to formula.
Back to formula?
That's not to say that Konami hadn't learned lessons from pushing the envelope. Whilst the classic ultra-hard platforming of the first game was once more the focus, Dracula's Curse gave players choice and replayability by allowing multiple paths to the titular castle. It also, for the first time, offered completely different playstyles as Trevor Belmont built his team on his way to whip Dracula's fangs down his throat. But first, that team would need to navigate devilish enemy placements and punishing boss fights.
Make no mistake, this game wasn't necessarily the hardest NES game, but unlike, say, a Battletoads, it was satisfying enough to make you strive for greatness.
Castlevania 3 may not have been a sales giant for the system, especially releasing late into its life, but it's fondly remembered as a connoisseur's choice. 1990, FZero.
It's very bold of me to select something other than Super Mario World for 1990, but to distract you from that, you know what's even bolder? Using your underdog marketing to directly call out your competition.
Genesis does what Nintendo don't was the battle cry of Sega that their console and its so-called blast processing was capable of far more than Nintendo's new machine. But Ninty let their games do the talking, and F-Zero screamed into high gear in a way that made players' jaws drop. The ingenious use of Mode 7, the overclocked frame rate, and the astounding 16-bit soundtrack meant that console gaming had rarely felt so futuristic and exciting. Where some games used Mode 7 sparingly but effectively, it was the core component of Nintendo's Sci-Fi Racer. This enabled players to see far more of the track ahead of them and gave the incredible illusion of 3D, allowing the team to construct a wholly original racing game, which is another notch on Captain Falcon's bounty hunting belt. While Super Famicom games games released at a steady pace, the console launched in Japan with 2 titles. One of these was the wonderful but safe Super Mario World. The other was this intense racing IP that came out of nowhere and left Sega lusting for a super fast title of their own. 1991, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. And so, in 1991, Sega released Sonic the Hedgehog. Nintendo was about to have some real competition, and for a little while, even become the number 2 company in the console space. Fighting back in their honour, however, was what would start to shape itself as one of the Big N's most important properties. Zelda: A Link to the Past fleshed out everything that came before so naturally that it almost feels obvious, adding the likes of the Master Sword and a lot of the real history and lore of Hyrule. A Hyrule that was not just gorgeous and vibrant, but full of surprises. The biggest of which was the shock that the game had 2 massive maps. Most impressively, swapping from one to the other only took a couple of seconds, and yet, like the top-down perspective of the first game had done before, it forced players to think about their exploration in a totally fresh way. It's hard to nail down everything A Link to the Past did right, as like the original game, it was so often about a feeling. There was so much pure joy oozing from every pore of Link's 1991 adventure that it still felt by fans both old and new today. 1992, Dragon Quest V. It's important to know that the likes of Zelda and Final Fantasy don't get to where they are without Yuji Horii and Dragon Quest. The originator of the Japanese RPG, most entries in the franchise are in the running for gold in their respective years, but Dragon Quest V was particularly special. The game starts with the birth of the player character and follows them through the transitional moments of their life, the death of their parents, marriage, childbirth, and a search for identity that pervades through it all. Your wife and kids being part of the story and playable characters rather than a roving pack of wandering heroes was a simple stroke of genius. It makes for an incredibly intimate and personal tale set within a familiar framework of a bombastic adventure. On top of this, the adventure introduces the now serious staple monster collecting to serve as the bulk of your party, and a revised and more customizable tactic system for battle. Sure, Dragon Quest V was fairly criticised for not evolving its visuals or UI as a debut entry for the system, however, it was easy to forgive the game's faults when the story was this touching and personal.
The only thing unforgivable was making players outside of Japan wait over 16 years for a port.
1993, Star Fox. Whereas in certain generations the next major milestone of gaming isn't necessarily obvious and might simply boil down to more power, the advent of 3D gaming was a clear horizon that the industry was moving towards. For a time, many franchises implemented tricks to use 2D elements in a way that appeared to give them more depth, like Mode 7 in fact. Star Fox was not one of these games. Famously the first game to feature Argonaut's Super FX chip built into the cartridge, the 1993 sci-fi rail shooter was the first home console game to feature 3D polygonal graphics. It was simply stunning that a machine that hadn't been natively designed to produce such effects did so this flawlessly. Star Fox was fast and frantic with a thumping soundtrack to match, and like the sharp points of the game's polygonal R-wing, was cutting edge. The game was a breath of fresh air, a worthy contribution to any SNES owner's collection, and revolutionised gaming. 1994, Super Metroid. Speaking of which, there are a handful of titles out there that can claim they shook gaming to its core, but very few have entire genres named after them. Whilst Super wasn't the first Metroid game, it was absolutely the one that perfected the formula. Samus Aran's third outing, even more than the previous two, ingeniously presented something that filled a niche, an adventure with a tight yet winding, interconnected and constantly unfolding map that spoke to players who were tired of running from left to right to finish individual stages, but also weren't fans of full-on RPGs. It also almost wordlessly communicated a beautiful tale that really flipped the perspective of the parasitic Metroid creatures. It may not be one of the console's best sellers, but to this day, Super Metroid is still beloved and heralded as not just one of the best games in its series, but of the genre it helped create. Players all over the world 20 years later are still enjoying it pure and otherwise breaking it with speedruns and randomizers.
This level of devotion doesn't happen without Super Metroid being a deeply satisfying game to play, with tight controls, luscious 16-bit locations to explore, and a deeply moody soundtrack.
1995, Chrono Trigger. Every now and then in life, the stars come together to create something truly special. In the case of 95, the stars were Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, Dragon Quest creator Yuji Horii, and famed designer Akira Toriyama, and the something special was RPG genre giant Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger innovated by introducing New Game Plus to the world, which worked wonderfully for a game that had so many missable events and alternative outcomes, such as some pretty major differences to the composition of your final party. It also more obviously set its turn-based battles in the overworld, taking advantage of a 32 megabit cartridge to smoothly transition from exploration to blasting poor boundalos into oblivion with some incredible looking combo attacks. Every part of Chrono Trigger was a shining example of how far gaming had come. The game contained some of the most gorgeous sprite work and animation ever seen, which helped to bring to life a story that moved effortlessly from tragic and emotional to goofy and slapstick. Said story, which dealt with time travel, had an incredibly rewarding pace, always setting up the next event before the last one closed up, drawing players onwards to the next time period.
Chrono Trigger was the perfect way to say goodbye to the Super Nintendo, and might well be the best the system has to offer. Period.
1996, Pokemon Red, Green and Blue. The Game Boy was released in 1989 and became the Nintendo console with the longest lifespan before being replaced by its successor. However, it's not appeared thus far simply because Nintendo's home consoles were always producing the biggest games year on year. And that's not to say that wasn't the case with 96 too, as this year the Nintendo 64 arrived and brought with it the likes of Wave Race 64, Mario Kart 64 and 3D platforming Revolution Super Mario 64. None of these were quite on the same level as Game Freak's Pocket Monsters, however.
Spawning an anime, mangas, movies, trading cards, action figures, plushies, board games, those bouncy ball things that had the Pokemon inside and you'd try and bite through to get the Pokemon. That wasn't just me, was it?
Despite the unstoppable wave of marketing and merchandising and the fact that creator Satoshi Tajiri made two, to arguably four versions of the same game, the heart of the first generation of Pokemon was undeniably pure. Born from a love of bug collecting and RPG games, Pokemon Red and Blue's easy-to-understand battle system, which paired up creatures that ranged from adorable to kick-ass, was not just a stroke of genius, but something that truly had a lot of soul. Its approachability set legions of non-gamers off on an epic journey in which they had total control, planning and constructing a party, swapping stories, and even Pokemon themselves with friends in order to track down and collect all 150, or 151 if you believe the playground rumours, and become the ultimate master trainer.
Pokemania was a phenomenon the likes of which gaming wouldn't see again until Fortnite Battle Royale.
1997, GoldenEye 007. When Sony released the PlayStation in 1994, they did so knowing that Nintendo's hold on all ages gaming was firm and therefore they could aim for a more mature audience.
But 1997 saw the release of the game that had PlayStation consumers visiting their N64 owning friends and family and getting to grips with the awkwardly shaped three-pronged controller to play the FPS game that was setting the world on fire.
GoldenEye 007 was a landmark moment in the shooter genre, being the most approachable and feature-heavy FPS to land on a console. It allowed players to more precisely aim around the screen and rewarded them with different hit reactions depending on where their shots landed. There was stealth, there was dual wielding, and there were a host of mad cheats to offer variety to the experience. Best of all, it supported 4-player multiplayer for split-screen carnage. Finally, the joys felt by PC shooter players could be realised on a wider scale. And it worked wonders for Nintendo and Rare, as every player who got to try GoldenEye at a friend's house was inspired to purchase it, making it the best-selling game for the system without the word Mario in the title. 1998, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time.
As previously noted in the PlayStation list of the same type, 1998 was one of the best years in gaming history. No matter what console you had, you were eating good, and the N64 had several great titles to choose from, but if there was ever a nailed-on entry for this video at all, it's Ocarina of Time.
If you know literally anything at all about video games, you know how important and beloved Ocarina of Time is. It's a title that entered the Video Game Hall of Fame on its first nomination, has been given endless retrospective rewards, and is the highest rated game on Metacritic with a near perfect score of 99. Whilst time may not have been kind to its visuals, and the franchise has arguably iterated Ocarina into redundancy, there's still a beautiful spark in Link's first first 3D outing. And that is the spirit of adventure, a wonderment clearly felt by the artists and developers who produced it that they were breaking new ground. The world of Hyrule felt diverse, huge, and full of secrets that, whilst recognisable to what came before, required the player to think again in new ways. It's truly astounding how much the team got right on the first published attempt, as Zelda would use Ocarina as a blueprint. Heck, so would a lot of other adventure games for the next 2 decades. With both of Nintendo's mascots translating over so well, the era of 3D had truly arrived. 1999 Mario Party 2. Whilst 99 saw many memorable titles land for the N64, Mario Party 2 should be recognised as the sequel that set up one of Nintendo's most prolific franchises. Making the original game look more like a proof of concept in retrospect, Mario Party 2 put into place so many series staples. More than just better boards and better mini-games, the title introduced duel and battle mechanics to add more direct competitive experiences. It's strange now to think the first game didn't even have items, and that was something that the sequel introduced. It also finally gave players a chance to practice before playing each game, meaning everyone had a chance to understand what was going on beforehand.
You were no longer exclaiming, "Oh, I think I'm getting this now," just as your friend completes every single mini-game. Sorry, flashbacks.
One of the N64's biggest strengths over its competitors was native 4-player support, a shrewd decision that Nintendo made the best of time and time again. The Mario Party series was a big part of the console's multiplayer lineup, with the second game in particular still held aloft as the superstar of the series. 2000 Paper Mario. On the other hand, one thing that the Nintendo 64 had an almost total lack of were classic role-playing games. The restrictions of cartridges over the PlayStation and Saturn's disc drives were such a difference maker that Square left Nintendo in the lurch to craft Final Fantasy VII for the PS1, leaving the big N without a developer for the follow-up to SNES cult classic Super Mario RPG. Instead, the jilted ex-lover Nintendo began crafting the follow-up themselves. Inspired by the so-called ultra-realism of 3D graphics at the time, Nintendo wanted Paper Mario to be a cuter and more charming affair than something like Super Mario 64. This birthed the unique papercraft aesthetic, stage playset battle arena, and a Mario who had never shown so much personality before. Paper Mario's all-ages vibe might not seem like it makes for the deepest role player, but it had plenty going for it. Timed button presses and flicks of the stick, depending on the kinds of attacks that Mario and its allies were utilising, caused more damage. There was the badge system for giving characters passive buffs, and outside of battle, each of Mario's allies' unique abilities could be used to navigate the world or find secrets. It might not be the first Mario RPG, and its sequel might be a better game overall, but it's absolutely the most important, as it created a franchise in its own right and inspired the separate Mario and Luigi series. 2001 Super Smash Bros. Melee. Whilst the GameCube era might not have been Nintendo's strongest financially, it produced plenty of solid gold classics. One of the best came in just the first few months of the console's time on the market. Super Smash Bros. Melee was the wine squeezed from the grapes of its predecessor, but its true strength was the perfect balance of its content. The character roster felt massive, but not intimidating in the various modes.
Classic, adventure, all-star, that one where you take your middle school angst out on a sandbag.
Kept players entertained whilst helping them to get better at the fundamentals.
Or you could just turn all the items on very high and let chaos reign.
It made for a deeply replayable package assisted by its superb engine that far outlived the GameCube itself. Even with multiple sequels in later generations, Melee's swift, heavy and exploitable engine set the groundwork for Nintendo's first eSport, accidental or otherwise. More than anything, Melee took the concept of the Nintendo Party Fighter to a level that made it gaming's premier crossover event. Just the opening video weaving through the likes of Zelda, Kirby, Star Fox, and surprising choices at least to Westerners like NES. The first 90 seconds was Nintendo hyped like we had never have before, and it became the console's killer multiplayer app for a long time. 2002 Metroid Prime. Despite clearly wanting to do more, Metroid is one of the franchises that Nintendo has struggled with most. Historically, the games have always sold better internationally than in Japan, so in a way it made sense to boldly hand off development of the franchise to a Western team. Retro Studios' shift to a first-person perspective sent fans into a terrified frenzy on its first reveal. But when Metroid Prime landed, first in America, a rare occurrence, the talk went flat. It was a refreshing reboot for a series that had been dormant for nearly a decade. Still, a lot connected the new Metroid style to its forebears. The precision-based shooting in its exploration and boss fights was more evident than ever, and there was the same thick, lonely atmosphere that players expected, with each locale stuffed with secrets to find and mysteries to unravel. Couple this with brilliant immersive touches that made players feel like they were inhabiting Samus's power suit, and the game connected with Nintendo's older audience who were hungry for games that pushed the envelope.
Samus had finally proven she could viably walk both the 2D and the 3D path and offer something different. To this day, both Super Metroid and Metroid Prime are the golden stars of the franchise, with the number one podium purely coming down to personal preference.
2003, Beautiful Joe. Nintendo have a long and checkered history when it comes to third-party support, partly in thanks to their choice of hardware. First cartridges and now proprietary mini-discs, but regardless, they managed to land a pretty sweet deal with Capcom to bolster their library in 2002.
This was a series of GameCube exclusive titles called the Capcom 5, of which only 4 were released and only 1 remained exclusive, which has to be one of gaming's funniest ironies.
The second of these was Beautiful Joe. In an era that was embracing realism, 3D exploration, and adult themes, Hideki Kamiya's stylish action platform went almost the opposite way every time. 3D environments were merely a background for a classic 2D beat-em-up, visuals were vibrantly cel-shaded, and goofy writing that was full of referential humour. Inspired by tokusatsu film in Japan like Super Sentai and Kamen Rider, Beautiful Joe's full embrace of the love of movies also made for a unique gameplay hook that utilised slow motion and after images in both combat and puzzle solving. It was a game that was bursting with joy for its inspirations and its own world. A game with this kind of oddball character could have only debuted on the GameCube. It may not have sold well, but Beautiful Joe made a believer of every player who picked it up in 2003 and beyond. 2004, Pikmin 2. Since Nintendo has a few core franchises they reliably lean on, it often falls to the new IP to truly define a generation. With the little purple lunchbox, the most noteworthy might be Pikmin, with the first game in 2001 and its stunning sequel 3 years later. With every new franchise, the first entry is often about proving that it can work, and the original Pikmin was a charming and cutesy facade on a deceptively tactical strategy adventure. Pikmin 2 took the formula and tweaked certain parts of it just enough to stand alone and debatably set itself as the apex of the franchise even to this day. Commanding Pikmin with the GameCube controller was more satisfying than ever, and Pikmin 2 offered a much higher skill ceiling despite the loss of the first game's strict campaign timer. In its stead, players battled competitively with friends, explored challenging dungeons, and ran in fright of a terrifying semi-transparent man with bulldozers for hands and feet.
The absolute fight or flight response this thing set off in me when it reappeared in Pikmin 4. Thanks, Miyamoto!
The series might not be for everyone, but Pikmin's incredibly unique vibe is what makes it such a delight, and Pikmin 2 is the most rewarding for those that really connect with that vibe. 2005, Resident Evil 4.
At this point, Resident Evil 4 has been ported to so many systems that someone to check to see if it hasn't gained sentience and isn't intent on spreading itself to as many homes as possible in some kind of hostile takeover.
And whilst the PS2 version may be what brought the game its first big wave of sales, RE4 was originally part of the aforementioned Capcom 5 and exclusively made the GameCube its home for 10 months. Resident Evil 4 is one of those games that's been spoken about so much that there might be nothing new left to say. And for good reason. Heralded not just as one of the best games ever made, but as a title that revolutionized the third-person action game, RE4 still holds up 20 years and a remake later. Resident Evil 4 keeps players in its grasp with utterly addictive combat punctuated with fresh ideas and set pieces. There's protecting the president's daughter, a battle on a moving boat, quick-time events, shooting galleries, the terror of the rattling regenerators, and some frankly insane boss fights. Games on Nintendo systems are often in the conversation for Game of the Year, but rarely is there a more universally agreed title than 2005's Resident Evil 4, even if most of those votes probably came from PS2 players. 2006, Wii Sports. There's something very funny about the year 2006. Xbox owners were toiling in the war against the Locust in Gears of War, PlayStation fans were sneaking back through the forests of Metal Gear Solid 3 with a subsistence release,
and Nintendo players waggling around remotes pretending to play tennis.
And somehow, despite the out-of-nowhere bat-poo insanity of it all, the Nintendo Wii was an overnight sensation, becoming the company's biggest launch and being in demand for a lot of its first full year. Obviously, Wii Sports is the best-selling game for the console as it was the pack-in during the Wii's boom period, but this was very much the right call to make as it perfectly demonstrated what the console was all about. A simple combination of 5 sporting events that were recognisable and easily adaptable to the system's motion controls, Wii Sports was something that most able-bodied people could pick up and enjoy almost right away. It doesn't have the depth or necessarily the artistic merit of Gears of War or Metal Gear Solid, but Nintendo's Waggle Olympics helped many create memories with all kinds of people in their lives, and for that, we salute you, Wii Sports. 2007 Super Mario Galaxy.
And so a new Nintendo console arrives, and so too does the mustachioed inevitability.
Whilst both narrowly missing inclusion on this list, Mario 64 and Super Mario Sunshine were huge hits for their respective consoles, landing in the top and third sales slot respectively. Thankfully, whilst Mario Galaxy did use what the Wii could uniquely offer, it was at its core a traditional 3D Mario platformer. More than anything else, Mario Galaxy's biggest strength was in its wild sightseeing tour of Rosalina's wacky universe, with its constantly shifting gravity and its endless planetoids, each with different shapes, gimmicks and objectives. The game kept players engaged or addicted by retaining the most basic Mario gameplay but offering a continuous stream of something new to see. And here too, since Galaxy's lushly textured score was the first time Mario had an adventure to the sounds of a real orchestra. Perhaps the most consistently good 3D outing that Mario has ever been on, Galaxy would remain one of the best examples of what the Wii could achieve in terms of its graphics, as well as how innate motion controls could feel, if done subtly. 2008 Mario Kart Wii. It's not surprising that when looking into which Mario Kart games frequently top the franchise in terms of fan favourites, the Wii edition is a regular number 1. After all, it sold like hotcakes, with even better hotcakes inside of them, and this is despite the fact that Mario Kart Wii is an infamously broken game, with speedrunners beating tracks in literal seconds by reversing and leaping over the finish line.
And the game turning Funky Kong into a superstar by virtue of him being blatantly faster than every other racer.
But in a sense, that's what made the game so fun. It had something for everyone. From the die-hard competitive racers with GameCube or Pro controllers to your parents who wanted to try out the surprisingly enjoyable Wii Wheel. Mario Kart Wii appealed to the console's mix of demographics with chaotic casual racing and, for the first time ever, online play. Each sequel is a must-have for its respective Nintendo system, but rarely has an installment defined a console like Mario Kart Wii did. And it's not just because Wii's in the name. 2009 Grand Theft Auto Chinatown Wars.
And the award for the most surprising appearance from a franchise on a Nintendo list.
Now, it's not like Grand Theft Auto hadn't been on Nintendo platforms before, but Chinatown Wars was a brand new installment that, more than anything else, made full use of what the DS was capable of. Almost to an uncomfortable degree. There was something hilariously icky about selling and moving, for the YouTube censorship's sake, let's say, pharmaceuticals using a DS touchscreen, like you were getting away with something that Nintendo shouldn't know about. The game had lots of unique moments all throughout its campaign that used the console's gimmick, and they had plenty of variety, from filling up Molotov bottles and arming explosives, to setting up a sniper rifle and burning documents. The core gameplay was more akin to GTA's original top-down feel, but with the ability to move protagonist Lee around Liberty City on foot. It was a refreshing reminder of, and an update on, what came before GTA went full 3D. So whilst there were plenty of concessions that didn't put Chinatown Wars on the same scale as the PS2 games, it instead made something great out of what it could do. That is to say that whilst DS fans may be dismayed that the first appearance from the console here is a GTA game of all things, it turns out that Chinatown Wars is the highest rated title on the system.
Weird.
2010 Kirby's Epic Yarn.
Now look, Super Mario Galaxy 2, I hear ya, but it's really more of the same kind of sequel, even if that same is great. But we have talked about the original Galaxy, so let's agree to just shout it out here and give it the silver medal.
After all, 2010 was a weirdly busy year for Nintendo. The West got Professor Layton and the Unwound Future, on top of new releases from Donkey Kong, exclusive Sonic Colors,
and... what's that? Oh, it's Metroid Other M.
But the gold and every other colour of the rainbow goes to the joy in video game form that was Kirby's Epic Yarn, one of the year's most pleasant surprises. Turning the Kirby series into something totally fresh, it's funny to look back at Epic Yarn winning Best Graphics Awards for the year, but it truly deserved it, as few games had attempted such a handcrafted feel before. With the Wii in the home of plenty of families, the game was a no-brainer buy for those with young children, but there was still enough flair for people of all ages to enjoy. It was the attention to detail and the breadth of that detail that made Epic Yarn such a wonderful experience. Even though the game presented next to no challenge, for example, players couldn't die, there was always a reason to keep going. Each new stage presented new gimmicks, transformations, or just fun visual ideas that kept it captivating. 2011, Pokemon Black and White.
Returning to the DS now, when we're back to the world of stuffing cute critters into spheres and forcing them to fight cults and criminals and that next door neighbour that you have weird feelings about.
And there were more of those cute critters than ever by 2010's Black and White versions, which added a stonking 156 new designs. With the series perpetually trying to find the right place to draw the line between new and nostalgic, the fifth generation of games outright did away with the latter, populating the gorgeous United States-inspired Unova with all new Pokemon. This in itself was a bold and controversial move. But whilst the quality of the Pokemon will always be up for debate, Black and White received universal praise for its story that actually posed questions about the morality of stuffing cute critters into spheres. Its characters asked players shockingly poignant philosophical questions, which crescendoed into one of the best final acts in the series. Every Pokemon fan will have a different ranking of the games, and Black and White to many were already a step down from the previous year's Heart Gold and Soul Silver remakes, but they should be commended for what they did right. 2012, Zombie U. The Wii U's launch lineup consisted of a selection of lesser versions of third-party games like Batman Arkham City, Mass Effect 3, and Assassin's Creed 3. In terms of exclusives, the console didn't have a strong start.
The best of the bunch, though, unexpectedly, was a Ubisoft title.
Far from a perfect game, with review scores ranging from good to good enough, Zombie U was still an excellent addition to the Nintendo lineup for a few reasons. First of all, coming off the Wii, it represented hope that the company was more open-minded about signing off on more mature titles. Secondly, it was one of the more ingenious uses of the gamepad that the console ever saw in its lifespan. Set in London during a zombie apocalypse, players used the gamepad screen as a map and inventory. There was nothing quite like the tension of looking between the TV and the controller, expecting a monster to come looking for lunch whilst you rifled through your backpack, end up eaten, and you'd reload as another hopeful survivor, able to find your former zombified self, or even your zombified friends with online functions enabled.
Zombie U was a rare breath of fresh air in an otherwise moulding, rotting zombie genre, and its ports to other systems came with the caveat of it was better on the Wii U. You can't really say that about any other game.
2013, Super Mario 3D World.
Nintendo posited 2013 as the year of Luigi, so it's some kind of hilarious irony that even still, he got overshadowed.
This year saw the release of the Wii U's highest rated, second best selling game behind Mario Kart 8, and one that, despite launching on a console with a limited audience, smashed Mario's previous sales records to bits.
Oh.
Super Mario 3D World was the follow-up to 2011's 3DS title, and whilst it didn't make great use of the Wii U's gimmicks, it certainly felt like the full-fat version of what 3D Land had offered on handheld. Now, players could race through the Mushroom Kingdom in teams of up to 4. This was the big appeal, something akin to classic Mario that was playable with friends simultaneously for the first time. This made for cooperative, but more importantly, competitive chaos, as Nintendo knew all too well how players get when the chance to outperform their friends presents itself. The game's crown mechanic of giving the highest scoring player visible bragging rights drove groups to put more and more time into the game. Super Mario 3D World also gave us the introduction of Captain Toad and his isometric adventures, and Cat Mario, a costume so popular that it showed up in the 2022 Mario movie. With great stages and plenty of content, it was the perfect blend of old and new, and one of Mario's greatest outings. 2014 Shovel Knight.
Now, before you start typing those comments down below about how this doesn't belong here, it does belong here because at the beginning I said console exclusives. And most people forget that whilst Shovel Knight debuted on the PC, it also came to the Wii U on the same day, 10 months before anywhere else.
Very rarely do indie games blow up to the point of consideration for overall Game of the Year, but Shovel Knight was such a moorish package. Kicking off a wave of nostalgia indies, what made Shovel Knight so brilliant was that it wasn't ripping off a specific 80s classic wholesale. Instead, it was an amalgamation of several of the games I talked about, 6 years ago at the start of this video and some of their contemporaries. Mega Man, Castlevania, Zelda 2, Ninja Gaiden and Super Mario Bros. 3. This attracted older fans who connected with familiar elements but found something fresh, which was also something that appealed to younger gamers. They might not have the touchstones of the NES games, but certainly recognise the level of challenge and the Dark Soulsian mechanic of dropping currency and having to reclaim it or risk losing it forever. The final parts of this ingenious recipe was wholly unique ideas, such as being able to smash your own checkpoints for treasure at the risk of replaying more of a stage. Whilst many were beginning to stumble on the slippery slope of microtransactions, long installs and bloated open worlds, Shovel Knight was a reminder that video games are supposed to just feel good to play.
And in terms of console players, Wii U owners got to play it first.
2015 Splatoon. You can never tell what Nintendo are going to do with new IP, yet nearly a decade later it's hard to pass if Splatoon was A, a wild surprise, or B, a surprisingly tame addition to Nintendo's catalogue, at least from a genre perspective. With dwindling third-party support, the company tried their own spin on a team-based online shooter.
And whilst this made all the sense in the world, I'm not sure anybody had squids that are also kids shooting coloured ink on oil rigs to mark their territory on their bingo card.
However, its zany approach really made Splatoon a feature title of the Wii U. The chaotic team-based fun of fighting for control by painting the scenery more than trying to snipe your foes was delightful. It also made simple but effective use of the gamepad, showing players a top-down map of the arena to see where their presence and ink was needed, as well as allowing them to quickly super jump from place to place with a touch of the screen. One of the best things about Splatoon was that it was a great representation of Nintendo's ability to support a game after release, something that they hadn't really been asked to do a lot of in the past. Like many games, Splatoon only got better with time, tweaks, and more content. 2016 Pokken Tournament.
It was clear early on that the Wii U was going to be a rough generation for the company to turn around, but in 2016, well, it was just a dud across both Nintendo consoles. A bad Paper Mario, a disappointing Star Fox, and a divisive Pokemon generation.
Thank goodness for the anticipated home console release of Pokken Tournament, the fighting game that pit the likes of Mewtwo and Lucario against Pikachu in a mask and a sentient chandelier. Like traditional Pokemon gameplay, Pokken was on the surface a game of rock, paper, scissors, whilst also being deceptively complex. More than just trying to outfox your opponent's choice of attack style, there was making use of the two different phases of battle, a diverse move pool, and a choice of support Pokemon. Battles looked as good as they felt, and it was cool to see classic monsters actually getting into a proper scrap. Whilst Nintendo's slow embrace of online play was where Pokken tended to live best, it was unfortunately lacking content elsewhere. Despite a Switch re-release, Pokken feels all but forgotten, which is a shame because it added something unique to a franchise that is often very sweet and twee.
And that something was beating Pikachu into a fine yellow paste.
2017, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. The darkest days of the Wii U were finally behind us. A new dawn had begun. In 2017, the Nintendo Switch arrived and put the big N back front and centre. With the console dropping in March, it had plenty of time to bolster its catalogue and make it a must-buy for the Christmas period, with Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Mario Odyssey, and its industry-shaking Zelda launch title. In many ways, Breath of the Wild was a perfect way to introduce the Switch, as you could play Link's new console adventure at home and then take it with you on your own adventure.
To work, to the shops, to a different room. Endless possibilities.
But obviously what made the game truly great was the boldness to just throw out tradition. Zelda's formula had gotten more tired than tired, and Breath of the Wild's laser focus on a feeling of discovery was key. Hyrule was now a wide-open expanse, and players were left to their own devices to conquer its enemies, environments, and secrets. Landmarks and shrines in the horizon drove players forward, and physics-based puzzles made them stop and think. The freedom of not just exploration, but the approach to it would eventually be bettered by the sequel, Tears of the Kingdom, but Breath of the Wild was an event that stopped gaming in its tracks. 2018 Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. When it comes to the most hype video game trailers of all time, few reach the bar that SSBU's reveal hit. With previous games including DLC and often guest characters from non-Nintendo property, there was always the question about whether Nintendo had secured contracts for more than one appearance. As such, when Solid Snake landed, who was missing from the 2014 games, and the trailer announced, "Everyone is here," more heads rolled.
And they continued rolling for the next 3 years as Nintendo released more and more incredible DLC offerings like Minecraft Steve, Kazuya from Tekken, Sora. That one still doesn't seem real.
Super Smash Bros. Ultimate deserves its flowers as a celebration of the medium we love through the eyes of the company that has been through the most. With 89 playable characters, 115 versus stages, over 1,000 pieces of music, Masahiro Sakurai's magnum opus is a museum in game form. It also helps that it's also the most complete version of the gameplay, with fast yet crunchy rewarding feedback and a great escalation from casual party play to something deep and challenging for diehards. With the best campaign of the series on top of it and the spirit system making for an endless stream of unique battle setups, it wasn't shocking that Nintendo said that the game was still one of the Switch's most played 5 years later in 2023. 2019, Fire Emblem Three Houses. Famously, Fire Emblem Awakening was the game that really caused the long-running strategy sim to blow up in the West, and also by extension saved its neck from the chopping block. Ergo, its debut on the Switch needed to maintain that momentum. And Three Houses met expectations by totally refreshing itself for the new age. Swapping out tired mechanics for something much deeper, the stakes of battles are now far greater as each unit has so much more individuality based on how you train them. Training is a part of the monastery, which houses the expanded social side of the game. This allows for greater control of the pace of the experience for both developers and players, who are rewarded for checking in with classmates rather than just bouncing from one battle to the next. This is made all the sweeter by incredible writing and voice performance, which is consistent across its gigantic cast. With 4 possible major story paths and a seemingly endless amount of customization options, Three Houses is one of those perfect Switch games that gets better the more you play. Fire Emblem Awakening lit a fire under the series, and Three Houses cemented it as one of Nintendo's most worthwhile properties, making sure that it's here to stay.
Unless we keep getting games like Engage, then maybe not.
2020 Animal Crossing New Horizons.
There was no more perfect time for a new Animal Crossing game release in a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad year when the world was collectively told to stay home and avoid human contact. Nintendo just so happened to drop their new social simulation game.
The Animal Crossing franchise is as iterative as it gets, with each new game functioning largely the same as the last. And 2020's New Horizons is no different. You shake trees, sell your fruit, buy furniture, and welcome talking animals to your private island whilst paying off a non-negotiable loan with notorious tax dodger Tom Nook. Of course, New Horizons' most complete version of this makes for an endless drip feed of content and events, and enough variety so that when you go online to compare islands with your friends, you're guaranteed to have a good time. The relaxed, cozy pace makes it easy to lose hours every day. We could talk about the importance of games for the industry's health until the anthropomorphic cows come home, but Animal Crossing was crucial in a different way. As a sales juggernaut, especially in Japan, where it nabbed the silver for the country's best-selling game ever, behind the original Pokemon, you almost certainly know, or in fact are, someone who was positively affected by New Horizons' release.
In the face of the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad year, Animal Crossing was the perfect salve. Whimsical, affable, and warm.
2021 Monster Hunter Rise. Whilst Monster Hunter had been low-key kicking ass for years, it wasn't until 2018's World that it truly exploded. The pressure to follow it up was immense, and the excitement among diehards for Monster Hunter returning to Nintendo was palpable.
The Switch had plenty of great games, but it was missing that kind of action game that players could really sink their teeth into. All their axe, all their sword, their bowgun, lances, there's glaives, or
It might seem daunting at first, but when Rise clicks, it does so beautifully. The game has an incredibly gradual difficulty curve, meaning that newcomers to the series won't even notice how far they've come until they look back. It also means it's easier than ever to experiment and find your ideal weapon style, with each one intuitive to pick up and plenty of depth for those who stick with it. Perhaps Rise's biggest improvements come in the form of control and traversal. The Palamute mount makes everything speedy, and the wire bug gadget offers verticality and the ability to ride enemy monsters into battle. The Switch's ability to go handheld might make some developers feel as though they should make their games piecemeal and easy to digest in chunks, and whilst Rise is certainly snappy, it has a mind-boggling amount of content and depth. 2022 Xenoblade Chronicles 3. If the Switch is a machine for a single franchise, it's Xenoblade. With the announcement of X coming to the console in 2025, it will mean every single entry is playable in one place. And while Xenoblade has remained consistently well received, the end of the trilogy sees things out with a bang. Across the board, Chronicles 3 represents the pinnacle of Monolith Soft's work. The stylized graphics are gorgeous, its gameplay is constantly evolving, and narratively it manages to smash the worlds of the two previous games together in a satisfying way that rewards long-term fans. Best of all is how these all combine, as the story's themes of freedom and crafting your own future absolutely apply to both the endless possibilities of the battle system and of Xenoblade going its own path. Watching the earnest first entry almost not make its way out of Japan and then pave a way for a series that has become a pillar of the Switch and reach its thus far conclusion is incredibly gratifying. Streamlined combat allows for more overall depth, and a stronger script means darker and more touching moments.
Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is unashamedly a JRPG for fans of the genre. Both huge and meticulous, it rewards players who embed themselves in all that it has to offer.
2023 Super Mario Wonder.
We all take it for granted now, but when it debuted, Mario was weird. Little Plumber Man grows big by eating mushroom he gets from smashing brick with his hand, stomps on turtles, travels through pipe, beats up dinosaur.
But when something becomes franchisable, it's easy for it to be pushed into a box. This is part one of what Super Mario Wonder does so well: change up the formula and surprise long-term players. The other, however, is that most of these inclusions feel so much like they belong that if you were told they've been part of Mario canon since the Super Nintendo, then you probably believe it. The stages across the Flower Kingdom contain a mix of enemies both classic and new in equal measure, and the debuting power-ups like Elephant and Bubble feel so natural. Of course, the central element is the Wonder Flowers, which warp reality around the player in whatever way the stage needs them to. This means that Mario Wonder can repeatedly throw curveballs on a course-by-course basis. One level you'll be riding a line of balls, another might make all the pipes in the stage start moving, another you'll be playing as a Goomba, and it looks gorgeous every second. 2D Mario had been stale for a long time, but Wonder takes it to strange new places, and we thank it for it. And finally, 2024, The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. All told, 2024 wasn't the best year for Nintendo, with the biggest first-party releases mostly being classic titles repackaged to keep the Switch's lights on in its final full year. Still, 2024 was at least a win for princesses, with both Peach and Zelda getting rare leading roles. With the franchise already heavily toying with physics-based tomfoolery, it's no surprise that Echoes of Wisdom does something in the same realm, yet pleasantly different. A sort of pseudo-sequel to the Link's Awakening remake with the same lush toy box charm, Echoes of Wisdom sees Zelda fighting less with sword and bow, and more outthinking her predicaments by cloning parts of her environment. Sick enemies on each other or drop rocks on their head and scale the cliff sides with whatever you can find and reproduce. This, of course, means that the game is completely breakable and unbalanced, with players falling back on a handful of super useful items over the 127 available. But in a sense, that's the beauty of it. It's your adventure, and you can absolutely fill Hyrule with beds.
Echoes of Wisdom might not be in the upper echelon of the Switch's astounding library, but a game that champions freedom of choice is the perfect way to end an era when Nintendo finally coalesced its home console and handheld markets. Here's to you, Switch, and here's to the Switch too, and here's to you for making it all the way to the end. Have a good week.